Good day, page 142, chapter 5, part 3, volume 2. What the archipelago stands on. There used to be a city in the far east with the loyal name of Cesarevich, Crown Prince. Revolution saw it renamed Svobodny, meaning free. The Amur Cossacks, who once inhabited the city, were scattered, and the city was empty. They had to resettle it with someone. And they did it with prisoners and the Chechists guarding them. The whole city of Svobodny became a camp of vanlag. And so it is that symbols are spontaneously born of life. The camps are not merely the dark side of our post-revolutionary life. Their scale made them not an aspect, not just a side, but very nearly the very liver of events. It was rare for our half-centuries so to manifest itself so consistently. With such finality, just as every point is formed by the intersection of at least two lines, every event is formed by the intersection of at least two necessities. And so, although on one hand our economic requirements led us to the system of camps, this by itself might have led us to labor armies, but it intersected with the theoretical justification for the camps, fortunately already formulated. And so they met and grew together like a thorn into a nest, or a protuberance into a hollow. And that is how the archipelago was born. The economic need manifested itself, as always, openly and greedily, for the state which had decided to strengthen itself in a very short period of time. And here, 3/4 of the matter was in the period allotted, just as with Bilamore, and which did not require anything from the outside. The need was manpower. A, cheap and extreme, and better still, for free. B, undemanding, capable of being shifted about from place to place any day of the week, free of family ties, not requiring either established housing or schools or hospitals, or even, for a certain length of time, kitchens and baths. It was possible to obtain such manpower only by swallowing up one's own sons. The theoretical justification could not have been formulated with such conviction in the haste of those years had it not had its beginnings in the past century. Engels discovered that the human being had arisen not through the perception of a moral idea, and not through the process of thought, but out of happenstance and meaningless work. An ape picked up a stone, and with this everything began. Marx, concerning himself with a less remote time critique of the Goth program, declared with equal conviction that the one and only means of correcting offenders, true, he referred here to criminals he never even conceived that his pupils might consider political offenders, was not solitary contemplation, not moral soul-searching, not repentance, and not languishing, for all that was superstructure, but productive labor. He himself had never in his life taken a pick in hand. the end of his days, he never pushed a wheelbarrow, mined coal, felled timber, and we don't even know how his firewood was split. But he wrote that down on paper, and the paper did not resist. And for his followers, everything now fell into place. To compel a prisoner to labor every day, sometimes 14 hours at a time, as at the Kolyma mine faces, was humane and would lead to his correction. On the contrary, to limit his confinement to a prison cell, a courtyard, a vegetable garden, to give him the chance to read books, write, think, and argue during these years, and to treat him like cattle. This is from the same critique of the Gotha program. True, in the heated times immediately following the October Revolution, they paid little heed to these subtleties, and it seemed even more humane to simply to shoot them, and those whom they did not shoot but imprisoned in the earliest camps. Imprisoned there not for purposes of correction, but to render them harmless, purely for quarantine. The point is that even then some minds were occupied with the penal theory, for example, Pyotr Stuchka, and in the guiding principles of the criminal law of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic of 1919, the very concept of punishment was subjected to a new definition. Punishment, it was their very refreshingly affirmed, is neither revenge. The workers' and peasants' state was not taking vengeance on an offender, nor expiation of guilt. There was no such thing as individual guilt, merely class causation, but a defensive measure to protect the social structure, a measure of social defense. Once it is accepted as a measure of social defense, then it follows that war is war, and you either have to shoot the supreme measure of social defense or else imprison. But in this, the idea of correction had somehow got muddied. Freudian slip. Muddied. Though, in that very same 1919, the 8th Congress of the party had called for correction, and foremost it had become incomprehensible. What should one be corrected for if there had been no guilt? It was hardly possible to be corrected for class causation. Something at you. By then, the Civil War had come to an end. In 1922, the first Soviet codes were established. In 1923, the Congress of the Penitentiary Labor Workers took place. The new basic principles of criminal legislation were composed in 1924. The foundations of the new criminal code of 1926, which hung around our necks for 35 years. And through all this, the newly found concepts that there was no guilt and no punishment, but that there is social danger and social defense remained intact. Of course, this was more convenient. Such a theory made it possible to arrest anyone as a hostage, as a devil person, even to exile the entire people because they were dangerous. Lenin's telegraph to Yevgeny Bosch, and the examples are well known. But given all of this, one had to be first-class juggler in order to still to construct and maintain in purified form the theory of correction. However, there were jugglers, and the theory was there, and the camps were indeed called corrective, and we can bring many quotations to bear even now. Vyshinsky, quote, all Soviet penal policy is based on dialectical combination of the principle of repression and compulsion with the principle of persuasion and re-education. Quote, all bourgeois penitentiary institutions try to harass the criminal by subjecting him to physical and moral suffering. They wish to reform him, quote, in distinction from bourgeois punishment with the sufferings of the prisoners in our country, excuse me, and not an end, are not an end, but a means. Just as there too, it would seem not an end, but a means. A.S. The end in our country, in genuine reform, genuine correction, is genuine reform, genuine correction, so conscientious laborers should emerge from the camps, unquote. Now have you got it? Even though we used compulsion, we are nonetheless correcting, and also, it turns out, via suffering, except it is not known exactly from what. Right then and there, on a nearby page, we find, with the assistance of revolutionary violence and corrective labor camp, localize the corrective labor camps, localize and render harmless the criminal elements of the old society. Unquote. We are still talking about the old society, and even in 1952, we still keep talking about the old society. Quote, pile everything on the wolf's neck. Blame it all on the old society. So not a single word about correction. We are localizing and rendering harmless. And then in that same 1934, the 2-in-1 task of suppression plus re-education of anyone who can be re-educated, unquote. Of anyone who can be re-educated, it becomes very clear that correction is not for everyone. And now a ready-made phrase from somewhere already flits about among the small-time authors, the correction of the corrigibles, the correction of the corrigibles. And what about the incorrigibles? Into a common grave? To the moon? Kolyma? Below Schmidtinka? Norilsk? Even the corrective labor code of 1924 was criticized by Vyshinsky's jurists from the heights of 1934 for, quote, a false concept of universal correction, unquote, because this code says nothing about destruction. No one promised that they would correct the 58s. And therefore, I have called this part the destructive labor camps. That is how we felt them on our pelts. And if some of the jurist quotations fit together crookedly, so be it. Just go raise up Shtuka from the grave, or drag out Vyshinsky and let them make head or tail of it. I am not to blame. It is only now, on sitting down to write my own book, that I decided to leaf through my predecessors' works. Yes, good people had to help even here, because you'd not now be able to find their works anyways. As we dragged our soiled camp pea jackets about, we never even guessed at the existence of such books, that all our life there in camp was determined not by the will of the citizen chief, but by some kind of legendary labor code alone. Even the chief of the camp, a major, wouldn't have believed it for anything. published in an edition for official use only, never held in anyone's hands, and no one knew whether they were still kept in the Gulag safes, or whether they had all been burned as wrecking activity. Neither were quotations from them hung up in the cultural and educational corners, nor were their miserable figures proclaimed from the wooden rostrums. How many hours long was the workday? How many rest days in a month? Is there payment for labor? Was there any provision for mutilation? Yes, and you would get a big horse laugh from your fellow Czechs too if you even asked such questions. Our diplomats were the ones who had seen and read these humane words. They had, it would seem, held up and brandished this booklet at international conferences. Indeed, I myself have only now obtained the quotations, and even now my tears flow. In the Gulag Principles of 1919, given the fact that punishment is not vengeance, then it may include no elements of torture. In 1920, the use of the condescending, familiar form of address is forbidden in speaking to prisoners. And forgive my language, but what about a blank in the mouth? Is that permissible? The corrective-labor code of 1924, Article 49, quote, the prison regime must be deprived of all elements of torture, handcuffs, punishment cells, strict solitary confinement, deprivation of food, visits through a grating only are under no circumstances permitted, unquote. Well, that's enough, and there are no later instructions. That's enough even for the diplomats, and not even that is needed by Gulag. And in the Criminal Code of 1926, there was an Article 9. I learned about it by chance, and I learned it by heart. Quote, measures of social defense may not have as their purpose the infliction of physical suffering or the humiliation of human dignity, and do not aim at exacting revenge and retribution, unquote. Now that is clarity for you, because I enjoyed catching our bosses out on legal grounds. I often rattled off this section to them, and all these protectors of ours only popped their eyes in astonishment and indignation. There were old veterans who had served for 20 years, who were nearing their pensions, who had never yet heard of any Article 9, and for that matter, had never held the code in their hands. Oh, what an intelligent, far-sighted, humane administration from top to bottom, unquote, as Supreme Court Justice Leibowitz of New York State wrote in Life magazine, after having visited Gulag. Quote, in serving out his term of punishment, the prisoner retains a feeling of dignity, unquote. That is what he comprehended and saw. Oh, fortunate New York State to have such a perspicacious jackass for a judge. And oh, you well-fed, devil-made care, nearsighted, irresponsible foreigners with your notebooks and your ballpoint pens, beginning with those correspondents who back in camp asked the Czechs questions in the presence of the camp chiefs. How much you have harmed us in your vain passion to shine with understanding in areas where you did not grasp a lousy thing. Human dignity of persons condemned without trial, who are made to sit down beside the Stolopin cars at stations with their rear ends in the mud, who, at the whistle of the citizen jailer's lash, scrape up with their hands the urine-soaked earth and carry it away so as not to be sentenced to the punishment block. Oh, those educated women who, as a great honor, have been found worthy of laundering the linen of the citizen chief of the camp and of feeding his privately owned pigs, and who, at his first drunken gesture, have to make themselves available so as not to perish on general work the next day. Fire, fire, the branches crackle, and the night wind of late autumn blows the flame of the bonfire back and forth. The compound is dark. I am alone at the bonfire, and I bring in still more carpenter's shavings. The compound here is a privileged one, so privileged that it is almost as if I were out in freedom. This is an island of paradise. This is Marfino Sharashka. A scientific institute staffed with prisoners. In its most privileged period, no one is overseeing me, calling me to a cell, chasing me away from the bonfire. I am wrapped in a padded jacket, and even then is chilly in the penetrating wind. But she, who has already been standing in the wind for hours, her arms straight down, her head drooping, weeping, then growing numb and still, and then again she begs piteously, "Citizen Chief, forgive me, please forgive me, I won't do it again." The wind carries her moan to me, just as if she were moaning in my ear, next to my ear. The citizen chief at the gatehouse fires up his stove and does not answer. This was the gatehouse of the camp next door to us. From which workers came into our compound to lay water pipes and to repair the old ramshackle seminary building. Across from me, beyond the artfully intertwined, many-stranded barbed wire barricade and 2 steps away from the gatehouse, beneath a bright lantern, stood a punished girl, head hanging, the wind tugging at her grey work skirt, her feet growing numb from the cold, a thin scarf over her head. It had been warm during the day when they had been digging a ditch in our territory, and another girl, slipping down the ravine, had crawled her way to the Vladikino highway and escaped. The guard had bungled, and Moscow city buses ran right along the highway. When they caught on, it was too late to catch her. They raised the alarm. The mean, dark major arrived and shouted that they had failed to catch the fugitive girl. The entire camp would be deprived of visits and parcels for a whole month because of her escape. And the women brigadiers went into a rage, and they were all shouting, one of them in particular, who kept viciously rolling her eyes, "Oh, I hope they catch her, the bitch. I hope they take the scissors and clip, clip, take off all their hair in front of the lineup," unquote. This wasn't something she had thought up herself. This was the way they punished women in the Gulag. But the girl, who was now standing outside of the gatehouse in the cold, had sighed and said instead, quote, "At least she can have a good time out in freedom for all of us," unquote. The jailer overheard what she said, and now she was being punished. Everyone had been taken off to the camp, but she had been set outside there to stand at attention in front of the gatehouse. It had been at 6 p.m. and it was now 11 p.m. She tried to shift from one foot to another, but the guard stuck out his head and shouted, quote, "Stand at attention, whore, or else it would be worse for you," unquote. And now she was not moving, only weeping. Quote, "Forgive me, citizen chief, let me into the camp. I won't do it anymore," unquote. But even in the camp, no one was about to say to her, "All right, idiot, come on in." The reason they were keeping her out there so long was that the next day was Sunday and she would not be needed for work. Such a straw blonde, naive, uneducated slip of a girl. She had been imprisoned for some spool of thread. What a dangerous thought you expressed there, little sister. They want to teach you a lesson for the rest of your life. Fire, fire. We fought the war, and we looked into the bonfire to see what kind of victory it would be. The wind wafted a glowing husk from the bonfire. To that flame and to you, girl, I promise the whole wide world will read about you. This was happening at the end of 1947, a few days before the 30th anniversary of the October Revolution in our capital, city of Moscow. We had just celebrated 800 years of its cruelties, little more than a mile away from the all-Union Agricultural Fairgrounds, and a half-mile away from the Ostankino Museum of Serfs, Arts, and Handicrafts. Serfs. This comparison occurred to many when they had the time to think about it, and not accidentally either. Not just individual features, but the whole central meaning of their existence was identical for serfdom and the archipelago. They were forms of social organization for the forced and pitiless exploitation of the unpaid labor of millions of slaves. 6 days a week, and often 7, the natives of the archipelago went out to fatiguing Barshina, forced labor, which did not bring them even the least little return. They were allowed neither a 5th day nor even a 7th in which to work for themselves, because their sustenance was a mezyashina, a monthly serf ration, a camp ration. They were divided just precisely into the categories of those paying their dues in the form of forced labor, Group A, and the household serfs, Group B, who directly served the estate owner, chief of the camp, and the estate, the compound. Only those totally unable to get down from their peasant stoves, board bunks, were recognized as infirm, Group C, and similarly there were punishments for offenders, Group D, except for the difference that the estate owner, acting in his own interest, punished with a lash in the stable and the loss of fewer work days, and he had no punishment block, whereas, in accordance with state instructions, the chief of the camp placed the culprit in the Ch5 penalty isolator, or the Bur, the strict regimen barracks. Like the estate owner, the chief of the camp could take any slave to be his lackey, cook, barber, or jester, and he could also assemble a serf theater if he wished. He could take any slave woman as a housekeeper, a concubine, or a servant. Like an estate owner, he could play tricks and show his temper as much as he liked. The chief of the Khimki camp, Major Volkov, noticed that a girl prisoner was drying her long flaxen locks in the sun after washing them, and for some reason this made him angry, and he shouted, "Cut off her hair." And whenever the camp chief or estate owner changed all his habits, all the slaves obediently awaited the new master, made guesses about his habits, and surrendered in advance to his power. Being in serf took little thought for the morrow, nor did the prisoner. The serf could not marry without the master's permission, and it was even more the case that the prisoner could acquire a camp wife not chosen his slave's fate, since he was not to blame for his birth. Neither did the prisoner choose his. He also got into the archipelago by pure fate. This similarity has long since been discerned by the Russian language. Quote, "Have you fed the people?" Quote, "Have you sent the people out to work?" Quote, "How many people do you have there?" quote, send me one person. People, whom do they mean? That's the way they talk about serfs. And that is how they speak about prisoners. One cannot speak like that about officers or leaders, however. Quote, how many people do you have? Unquote, no one would understand you. But there are some who will object that nonetheless there are really not so many similarities between serfs and prisoners. There are more differences, and we agree with that. There are more differences, but what is surprising is that all the differences are to the credit of serfdom, and all the differences are to the discredit of GULag Archipelago. The serfs did not work longer than from sunrise to sunset. The sex started work in darkness and ended in darkness, and they didn't always end either. For the serfs, Sunday was sacred, and the 12 sacred Orthodox holidays as well, and local saints' days, and a certain number of the 12 days of Christmas. They went about in mummers' costumes. The prisoner was fearful. On the eve of every Sunday, he didn't know whether they would get it off, and he never got holidays at all, just as the Volga didn't get any days off, remember? Those 1st of May and those 7th of November involved more miseries with searches and special regimen than the holidays were worth, and a certain number were put into punishment blocks every year precisely on those very days. For the serfs, Christmas and Easter were genuine holidays, and as for a body search, either after work or in the morning or at night, stand next to your cots. The serfs knew not of these. The serfs lived in permanent huts, regarding them as their own, and when at night they lay down on top of their stoves, or on their sleeping platform between ceiling and stove, the palati, or else on a bench, they knew, this is my own place. I've slept here forever and ever, and I always will. Prisoner did not know what barracks he would be in on the morrow, and even when he returned from work, he could not be certain that he would sleep in that place at night. He did not have his own sleeping shelf or his own multiple bunk. He went wherever they drove him. The serf on Barushina, or forced labor, had his own horse, his own wooden plow, axe, scythe, spindle, chest, dishes, and clothes. Even the household serfs, as Herzen writes, always had some clothes of their own which they could leave to their nearest and dearest, and which were almost never taken away by the estate owner. In the spring, the Zek was forced to turn in his winter clothing, and in the autumn to turn in his summer clothing. At inventories, they emptied his bag and took away for the government every extra piece of clothing. He was not permitted to have even a small penknife or a bowl. As far as livestock was concerned, only bite. One way or another, a serf would cast his line and catch a fish. The Zek caught fish only with a spoon and only in his gruel. The serf had a little cow named Brownie, or at least a goat and chickens. The Zek's lips never touched milk, and he'd never seen a hen's eggs for whole decades, and probably he'd not recognize him if he did. Old Russia, which experienced Asiatic slavery for 7 whole centuries, did not for the most part know famine. Quote, in Russia no one ever died of starvation, unquote, said the proverb. And a proverb is not made up out of lies and nonsense. The serfs were slaves, but they had full bellies. The archipelago lived for decades in the grip of a cruel famine. The Zeks would scuffle over a herring tail from the garbage pail. For Christmas and Easter, even the thinnest serf peasant broke his fast with fat bacon, but even the best worker in camp could get fat bacon, only in parcels from home. The serfs lived in families. The sale or exchange of a serf away from his family was universally recognized and proclaimed as barbarism. Popular Russian literature waxed indignant over this. hundreds of serfs, perhaps thousands, but this is unlikely, were torn from their families, but not millions. The Zek was separated from his family on the first day of his arrest, and in 50% of all cases, forever. If a son was arrested with his father, as we heard from Vitkovsky, or a wife together with her husband, the greatest care was taken to see that they did not meet at the same camp, and if by some chance they did meet, they were separated as quickly as possible. Similarly, every time a man and a woman's act came together in camp for fleeting or real love, they hastened to penalize them with the punishment cell, to separate them and send them away from one another. And even the most sentimental of our writing ladies, Marietta Shaginin or Tatiana Tess, never let fall a single silent tear into their kerchiefs about that. Well, of course, they didn't know, or else it was necessary, or else thought it was necessary. And even the herding of serfs from one place to another didn't occur in a frenzy of haste. They were permitted to pack their goods and chattels, to gather up their movables, and to move calmly a score or so of miles away. But a prisoner transport would hit the Zek like a sudden squall, 20 minutes or 10, just time enough to turn in camp property, and his entire life would be turned upside down. He would go off somewhere to the ends of the earth, maybe forever. In the life of one serf, there was hardly ever more than one move, and most often they stayed put. But a native of the archipelago, unfamiliar with prisoner transports, couldn't have been found. And many Zeks were moved 5, 7, even 11 times. Some serfs managed to escape to the freer Averbakh system, a fixed money payment to the serf owner, and the Averbakh serfs might travel far out of sight of the cursed master, go into trade, enrich themselves, and live like free people. But even the Zeks, privileged enough to go about without convoy, lived inside the same camp compound and had to drag themselves early in the morning to the very same type of work to which the column of other Zeks was driven. The household serfs were for the most part degenerate parasites. Servants are a boorish spawn, the saying goes. They lived off the labor of the Berashina serfs, but at least they themselves did not rule over the Berashina serfs. It was doubly nauseating for the Zek that, in addition to everything else, the degenerate trustees directed and ordered them around, and in general the entire situation of the serfs was alleviated by the fact that the estate owner had necessarily to be merciful to them. They were worth money. Their work brought him wealth. The camp chief was merciless to the prisoners. He had not bought them, and he would not be willing them to his children, and if they died, others would be sent to him. Now we got ourselves involved to no purpose in comparing our Zeks with the serfs of the estate owners. The situation of the latter, one has to admit, is very much less harried and more humane. A closer comparison of the situation of the natives of the archipelago would be with the factory serfs of the Urals, the Altai, the Nerchinsk, or the inhabitants of the Arakcheyev. The semi-military settlements. Some people object, however, even this they too had a good. The Arakcheyev settlements. In the Arakcheyev settlements, there were There were also nature, family, and holidays. Only the slavery of the ancient East is a fair comparison, and there is only one, just one, plus which comes to mind. On the side of the sex as opposed to the serfs, the prisoner might land in the archipelago even as a juvenile of 12 to 15, but not from the very day of his birth. He did at least snatch a number of years in freedom before imprisonment. As for the advantage of a definite sentence in comparison with a lifetime of peasant serfdom, there are many qualifications, namely, if the term was not a quarter, 25 years, if the article was not 58, if it wasn't until special orders, if they didn't paste a second term on the prisoner in camp, if the end of his term, the prisoner was not automatically sent off into exile, if the prisoner, after being released, was not sent straight back to the archipelago as a repeater. There is such offensive qualifications, in fact, that, after all, it is only fair to recall that sometimes the nobleman master too might manumit his serf out of whimsy. That is why, when the Emperor Mikhail informed us at the Lubyanka about the anecdotal deciphering of the initials of the Soviet Bolshevik Party, VKPB, current among Moscow workers, at that very same time, Victoria Presposnoye Pravo, Bolsheviks, second serfdom, Bolsheviks, this did not seem to us so much funny as prophetic. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.